Good morning. This is Tony Abatini from Beyond the Ball, bringing you another exciting episode from Chester, New York. We are thrilled to have Will the Thrill Marshall with us from 108 Performance in Knoxville, Tennessee. Some of you are aware that we now are doing all these wonderful instructional and training and coaching educations with our friends down in 108 Performance with Will Marshall and Eugene Bleeker and Nate Headley and Ryan McMillan and the boys. But we're privileged this week that we have Will Marshall on campus. And hot topic, we're seeing it at the Major League Baseball level with so many Tommy John elbow injuries coming down. Throwing and injuries are at an epidemic, both at the professional level and even at the amateur level. So we wanted to put Will the Thrill, or the Throwing Yoda as he's known internationally, what is going on at the amateur level, and how can we prevent some of these injuries? Well, my first question really, is there a problem at the youth level? We know at the major league level, guys are throwing 100 miles an hour. Maybe the human body was not equipped to be throwing at that speed all the time. But for the youngsters and for the youth coaches that are out there, what are you seeing from your perspective?
Yeah. Tony, first off, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I think there's two sides of the coin. Some people are saying that kids are throwing too much. There's no off season. They're throwing year round. They're training and playing all year round. There's no argument for that. And then the other side of the coin is, believe it or not, kids are throwing less than they ever have, which sounds kind of absurd, but when you think about it, most of the time growing up, kids were playing wiffle ball, wall ball, stick ball in the street from the time they got home from school to the time it was pitch black and they couldn't see their hand in front of their faces. And nowadays, the only time kids are getting any kind of baseball, softball instruction is when they're at practice or they're at a game. So let's say they're making 50 throws, playing catch before the game, and 20, 30 throws in game, or if they're making pitches, right? They're pitching, anywhere from 40 to 100 pitches in the game with those 50 throws before the game. It's not that many throws when you think about it in retrospect, considering if you were going to be outside playing wiffle ball or playing wall ball in the street, you're probably making 200-300 throws in a couple hours of playing with your friends out in the street. But kids' arms didn't hurt the same way back then.
Interesting perspective, because you hear all the time, Will, they're throwing too much. They're throwing
Right.
too much. You look at Little League Baseball, you have the pitch count. And the position that we've taken many times is that you can have a young arm, a young body in overtime after 25 or 30 pitches if his delivery, I know we talk about movement patterns all the time, but if the sequencing, when the foot lands, is the arm in a good, healthy position to be on time to throw? Does the arm slot actually match shoulder rotation, which we know is the secret to throwing hard and staying healthy? I think that's where we struggle sometimes in helping the Little League and travel coaches, that it's great that you have a pitch count, but you need to be a bit more aware of how that young arm is throwing. Could you give us some insight on, and let's start with, we call it red flags. You're watching a 12-year-old kid throw. What jumps out for you that some of the parents and coaches can identify and hopefully fix?
Yeah, well, I'd say from a principal standpoint, before we even talk about a specific red flag, there are too many people that, from a pitch count standpoint, are saying that, oh my gosh, I have to keep them on a limited pitch count. Well, it's all form at the end of the day, which is the red flags you're talking about. So if I get under a bar to squat and you get under a bar to squat, and I squat with good form and you squat with absolutely terrible form, what do you think is going to happen? It doesn't matter if we're squatting the same weight. You're going to get hurt with bad form faster than someone with good form is, right? So at the end of the day, the number of pitches they're throwing, the number of throws in the day they're throwing, really is not as important as how they're throwing. And if they're throwing clean, they're probably going to last a lot longer as far as pitch count goes. They're not going to get as sore as often. It's going to be much easier for them to have the longevity and not have issues with their arm. So when it comes to those red flags, kids that actually are throwing more at a younger age, without the mechanical adjustments, without someone teaching them specific cues and coaching tips on how to throw, they're going to naturally figure out how to get their body to move cleanly faster, because their body's going to adapt the more throwing they do. The less throwing they do, the more likely it is that they're going to succumb to someone giving them a specific cue, or telling them to do a specific movement or use a specific drill. But the more that they figure out their own body, they get feel for what feels good, and they do it more on their own. So when it comes to the red flags, I think the first red flag that's probably overarching principle these days is that the last generation of coaches was really focused on throwing from over the top. And that was just a cue that was used, the last 2 or 3 generations. And so now that those players have come down and started coaching their kids, the first thing they're going to tell their son when he comes out to the ball field is, son, you got to get on top of the ball. You got to get your arm up, throw over the top, finish out front, follow through. All of those cues to a kid at a young age, he's not going to listen to those cues and take them in and use them as slight adjustments. He's going to take those things literally as mechanics that he thinks he's supposed to force onto his body. So in that retrospect, a kid goes from throwing what feels like natural to him to now forcing his body to do a specific movement. It can really be detrimental to how he's moving, and that now becomes part of how he thinks he's supposed to throw, and that might change the course of his career forever because you now have altered him from doing something that's natural to his body to something that's more rigid, robotic.
Interesting. Well, one of the teaching cues that we both use, both here in New York and in Knoxville, is literally to tell players sometimes to throw sidearm. And when you hear, when parents hear that, sometimes we become the antichrist, that throwing sidearm is bad for you. And the reason why for some the cue is helpful is that, to your point, if they're so over the top, using the clock analogy of almost 12 o'clock, and you're starting or trying to get them as a right-handed thrower to be closer to 2 o'clock to an extent, telling them to throw sidearm sometimes puts them in that three-quarter arm slot many times that allows them to be effective. Are you seeing that nationally too?
Yes, I would agree. And at the end of the day, you watch any thrower from 1930 all the way to 2024, everyone that throws healthy, their arm is matching the same plane of rotation as their shoulders. So in other words, if you're going to punch someone, you're probably going to rotate and punch them on the same angle that your shoulders are rotating on. If you go an overhand punch or you go for a hook or a jab, it's not going to be as powerful if you're going out of a different plane of your shoulders. No different when you're throwing. So when it comes to the over the top versus the sidearm dilemma, if we give a specific example, it's sometimes easier to follow and understand. So we always give the example of Pedro Martinez, right? And you could use any professional player, but in this example, Pedro came up as a minor leaguer, right, having a guy known for a low arm slot, right? And when he would miss, he would have what's called a minor league miss, which means he was flying open, right, and his ball was missing high and arm side. So their cues to get him to fix his high arm side miss, right, was to get more out front because his arm would drag behind him when he was flying open. So his thought was out front, finish out front, get to your release. And then it was to get on top of the ball because being with a low arm slot, when he would fly open, the ball, he would get under the ball and he would mess up. So the idea of getting on top of the ball actually got him to get the ball down in the zone. Those thoughts and cues were great, and the way it was demonstrated with them showing him over the top with their arm up over his head, right? Or showing it out front with, videos of Pedro from MLB Network reaching out front and pointing at the catcher. Those were things he felt like he was doing. But when you look at the adjustments he made, all it was that the angle of his trunk got a little bit tilted up, right? It was still a sidearm throw, angle of his trunk a little bit tilted up, and then his arm was a little bit more out front at release instead of it dragging behind his body because he wasn't landing so far open. He openly talks about landing, he thought about landing with his front foot landing completely sideways. Well, guess what? He didn't land sideways. He landed with his front foot almost perfectly straight, pointing towards home plate, but he felt like he had to land with it sideways. So I think we have a dilemma. In that generation, it was all feel-based, and players got so obsessed with the feelings. Nowadays, it's all mechanics-based. And so people being obsessed with the mechanics, they're taking what the field generation of Pedro Martinez and those players are now coaching to the mechanics-based generation, and they're taking those feelings and making them real things. So rather than just interpreting the words as something very simple, let me use that thought. They're saying, if Pedro came and coached a 9-year-old team here at Frozen Ropes, right? And he says, all right, I want everyone to get on top of the ball. What's every 9-year-old going to do? They're going to get their arms straight up over their head and pull straight down, and they're going to say, great, that looks good. But it doesn't. That's not good throwing. Most things become a thing because everyone does the opposite, right? It's a big eugenism. If you watch kids go play catch, they all throw from sidearm or submarine when they first start throwing. And over time, someone tells them they have to get on top of the ball, and that's when they get more of an over-the-top throwing motion. So Pedro interpreted the cue of getting on top or getting out front cleanly, right? And it just affected the way he threw, but it was helpful. Versus the kids nowadays, when we coach them to do that at 5, 6 years old, they're forcing the results. They're forcing themselves to change the mechanic, and I think that's where they get into issues. So when it comes to the red flags, I think that's where the issue lies, is the difference between teaching mechanics versus teaching feelings.
the long toss, pros and cons at what age? I know here, and we've heard this all the time, the formula is distance equals velocity. We know that a 12-year-old boy who can throw a ball 300 feet, and 300 feet would be a bit much for a 12-year-old because 300 feet would mean that he's got 90-mile-an-hour arm speed coming out. But is it a good thing? Should we be recommend to our travel and Little League coaches at some point, we say just let the children air it out. We've seen from our perspective, when you just ask them to air it out, their little bodies and arms align in a way in which you're going to be getting that low arm slot, which makes them throw more effectively. Yes or no, from your perspective?
As the 108 way typically is, right? It depends. Yes and no. Everything works and everything sucks. So in a sense, yes, long toss it can work for everyone. It can be effective to a point. So the analogy I like to give for it is most kids have played the game on their phone called Angry Birds. In Angry Birds, you've got a little bird on the screen, you pull it back like in a slingshot, and it shoots. It goes a certain distance. Well, not every bird can go the same distance, and it all depends on how much power you have in it, right? So similar here, every young kid only has so much power in their arm, right, or in their body that they can use to throw for distance. So if one kid that's playing catch can throw it 200 feet, like you're saying, and another kid can throw it 300 feet, what's going to happen when the kid that can only throw 200 feet and make it feel good on his arm, make it be clean and free and easy, what happens when he tries to throw it 300 feet? He's going to get tense, he's going to muscle up, he's going to probably change his arm slot, right? Because to get the ball to go further, he has to increase the trajectory of the angle of the throw. So he's now throwing in a slot that's not normal for him, that he wouldn't normally throw from, which is probably going to make his arm feel a little bit more sore, a little more tired afterwards. And it'd be like doing a workout that's not transferring to your skill. So why would you want to throw from arm slot that's higher that you're never going to throw from? It's not helping you get better at throwing from the slot you throw from at shortstop or when you're on the mound. So long toss is great for everyone to a certain distance and to a certain effort level. Just like all the greats have ever said, it's supposed to feel easy. It's supposed to be smooth. It's supposed to be free. So long toss to the distance that you feel you can make it feel good at. What distance can make your arm feel free and easy and would make sense, right? Someone who throws from a slightly higher slot is probably going to be able to get a little more arc on the ball, and they're probably going to be able to throw it a little bit further than someone who throws a little bit lower slot. They're probably not going to be able to throw the ball as far, and those guys tend to have a little bit more run and sink on their ball. So I give the example often. I went to a Dodgers game where Walker Buehler was pitching for the Dodgers, and he was warming up on one foul line, and he was throwing 300, 400 feet in long toss, right? Throwing these arc balls that are going a million miles. And then in the other foul line, we have Max Scherzer warming up for the Washington Nationals. And guess what he's doing? He's playing catch at 90 feet. Didn't make it past maybe 100 to 120 feet. Ball's on a line. Never got anything in the air. So two different guys throw from two slightly different slots, two different warm-ups. So it's not to say that long toss is right, long toss is wrong. I think it can help everyone to an extent, right?
I think you're right. It's a great point. I think it's a question of defining long toss. The challenge we see at the youth level is that when a typical Little League team warms up, one's on the right field foul line, one's on the left field foul line, and you have these 10, 12-year-olds literally 30 feet away from each other. And when you put young players that close many times,
Yes.
You're going to get the push. You're going to get the low elbows, as we call it. And so in an effort to combat that, and I like your analogy, just defining long toss, asking a 12-year-old to throw a ball 300 feet, you're probably putting that body in a position that is not going to feel free. Long toss is supposed to be about airing it out and letting the noodle do its thing. I think the advice that collectively we would give to youth coaches is you can air them out a little bit, but just watch them. It should still be effortless. It should be free. There shouldn't be major exertion that's going on. I think that's where long toss to an extent can make sense. Let's hit another topic that I know is a hot point, and we hear this at the youth coaches conventions that we've done. Pushing off the rubber, always be in a good position to feel the bunt, and make sure with your glove you're tucking your glove into your elbow. I just gave you three of what we believe are well-intended advice that maybe back in the day before the industry had 300 frames per second, we thought that's what they were doing. Walk me through in kind of some quick hits, pushing off the rubber, always being in a squared position to feel the bunt, and the swim and swivel teaching cue. Fans of it, not fans of it, when does it work? I know the 108 mantra is sometimes it's good, sometimes it doesn't work, and I think that's very effective with young coaches that are out there. There's not one drill or concept or cue that's going to fit everyone. So to say one drill is bad doesn't really give you an understanding that sometimes the bad drill is exactly what that young player needs, whether it's an overteach or just giving him room to play with. But talk to me first off on pushing off the rubber.
Yeah, everything's semantics, right? So at the end of the day, a coaching cue that worked for you, well, great, it worked for you. So it doesn't mean it's not going to work for someone else. It's just a matter of who's it going to work for, right? So when it comes to pushing off the rubber, again, semantics is the issue that gets in the way. It's the interpretation of the words that gets people in trouble. So pushing off the rubber does happen. When you look at the biomechanics and you look at the kinematics and the ground force data, right, that's happening in a throw, someone is actually pushing off the rubber. That is happening. But sometimes telling someone to do it, right, forces them to, what someone say would jump off the rubber, right, or leave the rubber too early or push out of their backside too early. It also could cause someone to get stuck on their backside and sink too much in their back leg and not actually move forward down the mound. So it's not that push off the rubber is a bad cue. In fact, most of the time when someone's doing too much of something, you want to either tell them to do it more or tell them to do the opposite. So for example, let's say I'm sinking on my backside, I'm staying back too much, right? Sometimes telling them to stay back even more will help. And on the other end of the spectrum, sometimes telling them to go forward will help. But usually they don't feel things well enough to understand where they are on the spectrum of forward versus back, staying back versus getting too far forward, jumping off the rubber versus staying back. So tell them to do the opposites on either end of the spectrum to understand where they're at, and don't get caught up in the words. If they need to stay back more, even though you think they're staying back too much already, great. Well, if telling them to stay back more works, then keep telling them to stay back until stay back is too much, then go the other direction. So I don't think pushing off the rubber is a bad cue, and I think it can work for everyone. The problem is that we're getting way too focused on the cues these days instead of just letting kids throw naturally and learn their bodies up to a certain age. Probably in the middle school to high school range is the first time they need to hear anything, if then, right? So push off the rubber, not a bad cue. The second one that you were talking about was finish in fielding position, right? A lot of people notice on the throwing side for being the guys that say, "Oh, these guys just pimp the finish," right? And it's flagrant, it's all over the place. It's it looks exacerbated, right? But at the end of the day, Greg Maddux pimped the finish.
Well, define pimp to finish, Will.
Correct.
Yes. I know. In New York, we call it the hot stove,
yes,
where you get to see that very aggressive cracking of the whip or recoil back. Pimp to finish in biomechanical terms is what?
Yeah, exactly what you just said. It's the hot stove. It's the recoil. It's where the body is rotated as far as it can across the front leg. It gets stretched out, and just like a rubber band, the body's going to recoil back reflexively in the opposite direction at the end of the throw. And so when you're seeing more of these recoil finishes that are happening now, they're not bad things. And I would say generationally, the last couple of generations have been forced to maybe finish in fielding position. But when you watch someone do that, they still have to recoil their body. It's just the way they're finishing. They're finishing in a fielding position to catch the ball that's coming at them, versus someone now who might recoil their body and pimp the finish, and they might spin off to the left. That was still happening back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It just wasn't happening the same way. So you go look at a Doc Gooden, you go look at a Lee Smith, a lot of them aren't finishing in fielding position all the time. They're spinning out of the throw, and some would say they're even flying open or flying off, right, from the target. It was obviously still effective and didn't change anything. So I don't think finishing in fielding position is a bad thing. Again, it's all about, does it get the player to move well? The cue can be good unless it's overdone. So the finish of the throw is important, and I think it's finding out for some players, spinning off the throw is going to be a good feel for them. For other players, finishing in fielding position is going to be a good feel. Yeah. So the last one you had referred to was the swim and swivel with the glove side. Glove side mechanics are typically reverted or aligned with equal and opposite. Whatever someone's doing on their glove side, they're going to be doing on their back leg, or on their glove side, they're going to be doing on their throwing arm. It can be a way to get their body to clean up. All comes down to whether or not someone is more glove side dominant or if they are more arm side dominant. Some people have more awareness for different parts of their body, and that's why when someone gets attached to saying, oh, I really just focused on swiveling my glove and pulling it to my chest, well, great. That probably means he had a lot more awareness for what was happening on his glove side, and that cue got all of everything else in his body to line up. Versus someone who might be a little more arm side dominant, right, is going to focus maybe more on how they finish or how they feel it coming out of their fingertips. Neither one of them are bad. It just comes down to how does the player interpret it. And again, at a young age, I wouldn't worry about teaching any of them any mechanics or cues. I would have them be playing as much wiffle ball, wall ball, burnout catch, and as much as you possibly can, and get them conditioned to learn how to throw.
I think that's a great point, Will. And when youngsters come in here early on, well, we want our son to do pitching lessons. And when we introduce them to wall ball and to just simply have a free catch, or we put a clock on them and say, you know what, you've got 3 seconds once you catch the ball to just throw it in different directions. It's the just be an athlete first and let the throwing clean up on its own without giving them a balance point, without giving them getting on an incline at some point. And it's interesting, some of the players that struggle at the high school and college level, well, what do we wind up doing with them? We put them back into just simply pure throwing, right? Knoxville, Tennessee, you guys are down there constantly playing wall ball and having a free catch and just letting them pure throw. Good information for some, yes. I think at the youth level, and this is my opinion, but I want you to feel free to agree or disagree, there needs to be more pure throwing. We need to get these young players to be not only more athletic, but have different feet. Let them throw on the run. Let them jump on the run. I think instead of the structured throwing lines that we see over and over again, it doesn't seem to be working.
I agree, and it's not that Tom Amansky was wrong in all of his baseball DVDs back in the day.
He was wrong, Will. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. Tom's not listening. He was wrong, but go ahead.
There was things that were overcoached and now have been taken to an extreme, right? And anything taken to an extreme is never good. You want too much salt on something? Well, maybe you can never have too much salt. But you know what I'm saying there. So I think when it comes to the throwing principles that you're referring to, if you think back in the day, everyone from amateur all the way up to professional, it was all rhythm and flow based, right? Looking at guys going over their heads and having these big wind up deliveries. It was about finding something that was smooth and free and easy on the body. And those guys were throwing 200 or 300 innings every year. Maybe the average velocity wasn't as high across the league back then, but there were still guys throwing really hard. There were no arm injuries. Guys were throwing 9 innings on 3 or 4 days rest pretty routinely, and hardly any arm injuries. And nowadays, it's not as much rhythm and flow. It's a lot more rigid and robotic looking in the way people go about throwing. So I would agree with you in saying that people need to learn how to free play. They need to learn how to play shortstop. They need to be able to play many positions, make different plays on the field, learn just how to be better at throwing in general. And when you get better at throwing, it transfers to every position you play, whether that's playing shortstop or being on the mound.
Let's change gears if we can as we wind up, Will. Major League Baseball does have a problem, and even though this episode was about the next generation, in your opinion, as someone who works with college and professional and major league pitchers, what's going on? How can you explain in layman's terms why you're seeing this epidemic of particularly elbow injuries?
There's many things going on. The players are arguing that the balls are having a lot to do with it, and obviously changing the balls does have an effect. There's also the time between pitches, right, with the pitch clock. That's actually making an effect because if you're not throwing cleanly, and then now you have very limited time between pitches, it's just really amplifying any of the bad movements that are going on, and it's shortening the window of time that it's going to take for someone to continue to compensate and move poorly. That will amplify some of the stress on their bodies. But at the end of the day, it comes down to throwing. And if you throw well, you're not going to get hurt as often as someone who doesn't throw well. So that's plain and simple where it needs to come back to, but it's the overemphasis and obsession from the organizations, from the culture of the people watching, right, the fan base and the players of thinking that I have to learn how to throw 100 miles an hour. And if their chase of that is kind of what's causing a lot of the issues, I believe. It's not that that's the wrong thing to do, because that's right now what's getting people paid. That's what the fan base is wanting to see. So you almost have to cater to that in a sense. But at the same time, you have to put your health and your ability to perform it consistently above all else. And so if you trying to find what makes you a good pitcher is what's most important, then I don't know if chasing velocity and putting your body at risk is really the way to go. So there's a lot of factors that play into it. But at the end of the day, if guys got better at what you and I have just been talking about, in pure throwing cleaner in general, I don't think we have as many issues as we do, and I don't think changing the balls or putting the pitch clock on really makes that much of a difference, even as much as that's what everyone's saying is the main factors right now.
Well, I think also, Will, and you listen to the orthopedic surgeons, when you're seeing somebody blow out an elbow or whatnot, that's not something that happened or something occurred 4 days ago or whatnot.
Correct.
Whether it's a slight micro tear, they're tracing back that maybe during winter ball the year before or 6 months ago, there was some tendonitis that led to some inflammation that now led to a tear, and all of a sudden now the end result is X. So I think, to your point, looking at how athletes are throwing all year round, there is certainly a need for rest and recovery. I think each individual athlete is different, but back to the youth level, I don't think shutting them down for 9 months and then jacking them up again to go play Little League in high school and then shutting them down again in the fall is the best thing clinically for them. Just having a catch every day, not necessarily throwing hard, I think is probably the best way to reduce some of these injuries.
Yeah, I wouldn't care if it's playing wall ball, throwing a baseball, throwing a football, but just to change the analogy, I would suppose it'd say, Tony, I'm going to teach you how to play guitar, and if this week we have a guitar lesson, and then next week you say, hey, I think I'm going to learn to play the piano, and we do piano for a week, and then you say, I want to learn to play the saxophone. We do saxophone for a week. By the time we go back to guitar 3 weeks later, you're not going to remember what you were doing, and your body's not going to be able to make the adaptations that it was in the time that you were practicing it. So the only way you're going to get better at a skill is by doing more of it. So Steph Curry's not going to go do a bunch of bench press and think that's going to make him better at jump shots. What's he going to do? He's going to go take 1,000 jump shots. So if we're going to go get better at throwing, guess what we have to do more of? We have to throw more. And the more you throw, the cleaner you'll end up throwing, because your body is going to search for the most efficient way, right, to perform the task without hurting itself. And so by putting actually the higher demand on the body, we will find the more efficient ways to throw. That doesn't mean throwing more and throwing as hard as you can and trying to blow it out, right? That's a totally different approach. It's how do I make it as clean, as easy, and as free as I can on my body? The best throws and the best swings anyone's ever taken, they always say the bat felt like a toothpick and the ball felt like it just jumped off. It's like a trampoline. The ball felt like it was a wiffle ball out of my hand, not a bowling ball. So the more you're searching for those feelings, the more you're getting closer to making consistently good throws. As your average throws get cleaner and cleaner, the stress on your body and your arm goes down. But just as you said, over time is how we see this evolution of someone getting inflammation and now getting injury. It's rarely an instantaneous moment, although that instantaneous moment might be the straw that broke the camel's back.
We can't thank Will Marshall, 108 Performance pitching guru, business development, the man of many trades, with us today. Those of you that have heard us before, the integration of what Frozen Ropes is doing and now with our instructional partners in Knoxville, Tennessee, we thought we were really good before, but some of the new products and information that we're now have been exposed to, thanks to Will and his staff, have been tremendous. I'll just finish up with, in a hitting standpoint, if a youth coach or a Little League coach doesn't know what they're doing, many times the kid struggles and he has a slump. On the throwing and pitching side, the consequences many times is arm injuries. And as we tell the parents all the time, you get one arm, right? That arm is a valuable commodity. And if you don't know the best way to improve, this is where having professionals like us or 108 or someone that really understands throwing. And I know the coaching clinics that we do, we spend more time on just simply let the children throw and just defining that and giving them some cues as to it's okay to throw sidearm and it's okay to throw on the run. And it's okay to throw the ball as far as you want, right? Defining what long toss is. But this is something that every youth coach, every Little League coach, and every parent needs to understand that. I am so tired of giving away the phone number to Dr. Dan Tomlinson, who's the orthopedic surgeon up in Orange County here. And he's seeing all kinds of issues with throwing. And many times, Dr. Tomlinson, Dr. Ahmad, all of the best are saying, it's not about how many throws, to your point, it's how they're throwing. And we're being shut down for months at a time, and then all of a sudden, with adrenaline, it's time to go to throw hard again. That's not what the human body and that's not what the arm wants to do. So this was great. We'll have Coach Will back with us at some other point on another topic. This is Tony Abatini from Beyond the Ball. Make sure you let the children play. Let them simply throw. We have free evaluations that are going on here, free evaluations that are going on in Knoxville, Tennessee. Come in and learn, right? Knowledge is power, but more importantly, knowledge is about your ability to help your team or your son or daughter. So feel free to visit us on campus at frozenropes.com, or you can email us at chester@frozenropes.com, or go to Knoxville, Tennessee, and you'll actually get a chance to meet the legendary Will Marshall and Eugene Bleak. All good. Have a great day, and happy May 1st.